Cette vidéo est sur le poisson. Welcome to another episode of the GameSmith, and after we finished production on our last video on whalebone scatter terrain, I found this. I can't resist. I have to do another scatter terrain using these bones, so let's get to it. I bought a bunch of these skeletons because they're just so awesome. I really like them because they have these working mouths. Also, this rib cage is really interesting. However, I don't like these screw holes, but that's easy to cover up. Now I got a bunch of these skeletons, but I'm going to turn one of them into skeletal scatter terrain, and the other one I'm going to turn into an undead monster. For both our builds, we have to disassemble our skeletons. All you need is a Phillips head screwdriver, and you're on your way. One of these skeletons I'm going to completely ruin, and the other I will actually reassemble. For our scatter skeleton, I'll just cut up the parts I want to use. For the parts of this video that repeat a lot of what we covered in episode 6 on whalebones, I'm just going to speed through. For both our builds, I want to tidy up our edges, and to do that I'm going to use a craft knife and follow it up with a nail file or an emery board. I really like these emery boards for filing because I can get a pack of them at the dollar store for really cheap. For our scatter, we want to remove this frame at the back of the skull. It's just going to be in the way when we attach it to the base. I don't need the back of the skull to be perfectly smooth because I'm going to cover it up. Next, we're going to use this antique white paint as our base and primer for our bones. For both builds, we want to make sure that we cover everything that's going to be visible at the table. This will be particularly important for our monstrous undead fish. Next, we'll use some white acrylic paint to cover the teeth of our skulls. Now, I'm not looking to create realistic teeth, I just want to create enough of an illusion to worry my PCs. I mean, look at the size of these teeth. Next, we're going to add this seraphim sepia or any other brown wash to our bones. Not only do we want this wash to be on the outside, but on the inside as well. I suggest that you complete the wash on the skeleton one side at a time so you can see how it pools. Also, you may want to stand the skeleton up on its side so the wash pools in the places it should. Next, we'll use this Newland oil or any black wash you want to use. I suggest that you apply the wash at the top of the teeth and let gravity pull the wash down into the gum line. When you're finished, make sure your model is sitting upright so that the wash pools at the bottom of the teeth. Next, we're going to add a white highlight to the teeth on our fish skulls. All we want to do is add a thin line of white along one side of the teeth. I suggest that you alternate where you put the highlight. If you put the highlight on the left side on the top row of the teeth, put the highlight on the opposite side on the bottom row. Next, I'll fill in these eye sockets with black paint. You should also feel free to use objects like decorative gemstones if you want to spice up your skeleton. Next, we're going to deal with our bases. For our scatter skeleton, I want to use cork as the base. I need to plan out a rough size for our fishbone scatter. And I'll use a Sharpie to make sure I cut the cork to the size that I want. All the cork that's being cut away I can use on this and future builds. And while we're making bases for our builds, I'll use this chipboard in order to make a gargantuan-sized base for our monstrous undead fish. That's a 4-inch or 8.5 centimeter diameter circle. Next, we'll cover our chipboard with some crumpled tin foil. We want to create a texture on our base just like we did in the coral videos. If you haven't seen those yet, I'll put a link in the corner for you. Our next step is to figure out where we're going to put our skeleton parts. We also want to plan how we're going to place the skull. I think I want to put a small column in the mouth. I also want to have the skull leaning up against a rock formation. I'll make the rock formation out of cork, but I think I'll attach it later after I know where everything on the base is going to be placed. Just like we did in the other videos where we created a cork sea bottom, I want to build up a few features with cork. I don't want anything elaborate for the build since I want the bones to be the main feature. I also need to build up the features that are going to be under the ribcage, just like we did in the whalebone video. Now it's time to add our 50-50 Mod Podge and gray paint mixture to all our bases. The glue in the Mod Podge will reinforce the cork and bond our structures together. Make sure you get the edges and down into all the nooks and crannies. Next, we want to add some texture to our base by sprinkling some decorative sand on it while the Mod Podge is still wet. We should do this for all our bases. Once the Mod Podge is dry, we add a second coat in order to seal in the sand and strengthen the cork. I tend to use this strategy to reinforce my cork bases, but if you find that you need something more rigid, I suggest using cardboard or chipboard on the bottom. For the round base, the tin foil and the Mod Podge should be sufficient to keep the base sturdy. After the second coat of Mod Podge is dry, we want to use the turquoise paint we've been using in our other videos in order to paint our bases. Once again, we want to capture the aquatic feeling that this color choice creates. I think this turquoise also feels like the Underdark to me, but the aquatic accents we add make it clear that this terrain is underwater. I think this will force me to find another color to use as the Underdark accent when that video series is dealt with. Maybe I'll stick with the turquoise. I really like it with this dark gray. If you have any suggestions for an Underdark color palette, please let me know in the comments below. Now, just like we did in the whalebones video, we want to add some decorative elements under the ribcage and inside the head. In addition to the shells, I'm also adding some colorful beads. The beads are both wood and plastic. I coated each with a mixture of Mod Podge and white paint to act as a primer and an undercoat. Then I picked some bright colors to paint them. Now, I suppose it's possible that I could have just left some of the beads as they are, but I wanted them to be clearly seen through the ribcage. As I've mentioned before, be careful not to clutter the base with shells and coral. Now we can start to attach our skeleton features to our base. I think I'm going to start with the large fin. We can use some hot glue to attach the bones in place. I then want to add a thick layer of hot glue in a few locations around the bottom and pour some aggregate into the glue. I can use a craft stick to push the stones into the glue and shape them. Repeat this process until you're satisfied with how the bones are looking. When the hot glue is dry, remove the excess aggregate. I used a brush in order to shake loose any particulates that were stuck, but not actually fastened. Before we add the ribcage to the base, we should remove the fasteners from the underside. We want the ribcage to sit flat on the base. To attach the ribs, we add some hot glue to those areas that will actually sit on the base. We should hold it in place for a few minutes to make sure that there's a good bond. Then, just like we did with the fin, add some hot glue on the unsightly features and cover them up with the aggregate. After the hot glue is hardened, clear away the excess rocks. Next, we move on to adding our monstrous fish skull. Before the glue completely hardens, we want to add the cork backing to it so that we can move the skull around if we need to. When the skull and the backing are in place, we can just add some aggregate around the bottom. We want to hide the seams where our skull and backing are affixed to the base. This will create the illusion the skull is sinking into the seabed. After the excess aggregate is removed, we cover the stones with our Mod Podge paint mixture. We want to blend these features into the base so that it looks like the bones have been there a while. Once the Mod Podge mixture is dry, we can add our turquoise dry brush. I recommend using a small tip brush for this. It will help keep the turquoise paint off the bones. Now we add some coral and seashell decorations to our monstrous corpse. A few colorful embellishments spread around the base will liven up the build and help create the illusion that the skeleton is underwater. A few more shells, plastic plants on our beads, and we're done this part of the project. Now we can finish our monstrous undead fish. The first thing we need to do is reassemble our fish skeleton. I could glue the parts together, but I'm satisfied with just using the screws. Next, we return to our round base and see where we want to attach our monstrous fish. We could attach our fish directly to the base, but that doesn't really create the illusion that it's swimming. Instead, I'm going to use this clear plastic container as a column, so the fish looks like it's floating. We can attach the container to the bottom of our skeleton fish, but we also want to disguise how the container is attached to the base. To that end, I'll put a large glob of hot glue in the middle of the base and cover it with aggregate. With a craft stick, I'll shape the small mound so it doesn't expand to a diameter larger than the opening of the container. We need to check our container against the size of our aggregate mound and chip away the sides until the container fits over top. This may take a few tests, but keep checking back and forth until the container fits.
When we're satisfied with the size, we use our Mod Podge and paint mixture to harden the mound in its final shape. And if you guessed we're going to dry brush the aggregate with our turquoise, you've been paying attention. It's very important that you get the correct color saturation when you dry brush this little mound. Once the container is mounted on the base, you won't be able to alter the paint, so make sure you're 100% satisfied before moving on. We can see our plastic container fits nicely over the aggregate mound, and it fits quite snugly. Now we're going to repeat this process on the outside edge of the container. Add the aggregate sparingly. You don't want to create a caldera or a cauldron-like hollow. I also suggest that you quickly remove any small aggregate from around the base so those little pieces don't get lodged under the container. Repeat the process in small areas all the way around the column. Of course, we need to Mod Podge our aggregate, but we need to be very careful when doing so. I'm using a fine brush so I don't get any paint on our clear container. Then we can use a larger brush to paint the remainder of the aggregate. When we apply our final turquoise dry brush, we want to be just as careful as we were with the Mod Podge mixture. Be sure that the gray layer below is 100% dry to avoid smudging the colors together. Now we attach our skeleton fish to the container. Of course, we want to maximize our bond between the two parts without having any glue spread everywhere. In this case, I'll cover half the container bottom with hot glue and press the skeleton into it. You won't have that long to make sure your skeleton is in the desired position, so double check. You should hold the parts together for at least a minute and blow on the glue to harden it quickly. The final touches to our monstrous fish is to camouflage the screws with our antique white. I think leaving the metallic screws visible would ruin the illusion. You could use modeling clay, green stuff, or even a glob of hot glue to cover the screw. I think the paint followed by the Seraphim Sepia wash will do the trick just fine. And when our brown wash is dried, we're finished our second build. I realize a lot of this video is repetitive of the whalebone build, however I couldn't resist using this monstrous skeleton in another project. The skeleton fish will certainly give my players pause when I place it on the table. Perhaps they'll encounter the bone scatter first, and then the monstrous skeleton will appear. And now I get to create a stat block for this undead skeleton. We absolutely must have the swallow whole monstrous ability. If you'd like to support what we're doing here at the GameSmith, please hit the subscribe button. If you're already a subscriber, please hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment. You might also check out our blog at thegamesmith.org. We post the building materials for all our crafts on our website too. You might also check us out on Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram. Until next time, I'll see you at the table.